Yeah, meeting is now streaming live.
Okay. Good evening, Istanbul. Good afternoon, London. This is another keynote speaker session of International Symposium on Economic Thoughts. And here I am to announce the speech of Lord Robert SKIDELSKY. He is very well-known Keynes researcher. He is the author of a 3-volume award-winning biography of Sir Keynes. He will be informing us about the place of usury in the economics of Master Keynes, which is accepted as the very center of his economics. Professor, microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Bulbul. I hope you can hear me. I'm very pleased to be giving this talk at Concept University. First, before I start, it's a well-known fact that the great-grandfather of our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was Al-Kemal Bey, a journalist and briefly a Turkish Minister of the Interior. But less well known is the fact that he was the Turkish translator of Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, and on which I'll have quite a bit to say later as I go on. What I want to do in this lecture is to pick out Keynes's attitude to usury, or taking interest on money loans, because it's at the center of his economics, not indeed of the Keynesian mathematical ISLM model, which is all most students ever learn about Keynes, but of what a pre-modern tradition would have called Keynes's natural philosophy. The capitalist system, he believed, was biased in favor of the creditor or lender against the debtor or borrower, and this was what caused it to go wrong. I'll trace Keynes's evolution of views from his reaction to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, show how this reaction influenced his mature economics, and then briefly illustrate the contemporary relevance of his views. But first, I want to discuss usury itself. According to the sociologist David Graeber, much of the history of the world can be read as a conflict between creditors and debtors. Whenever you have lenders and borrowers, creditors and debtors, you have a conflict about the amount and terms of the loan and the conditions of repayment. Creditors have always demanded full value repayment on their loans. Debtors have always wanted to be relieved of their debts. Who comes out ahead in this struggle depends on the balance of power between the two, domestically and internationally. And the outcome of that struggle is reflected in the value of money. Creditors, we may say, are natural deflationists, and debtors are natural inflationists. As there have always been many more debtors than creditors, it's not surprising that the value of money has shown a continued tendency to fall over the centuries, with some relatively brief intermissions when creditors regained control, usually under conditions of economic collapse. In theory, the government should stand above the creditor-debtor struggle as guarantor of the value of money. In practice, it has always been society's chief debtor because it has been society's chief spender. Pre-modern states were continuous borrowers. They borrowed heavily for war purposes and aimed to repay their debts from the spoils of war. In practice, these gains of war were never sufficient, even for the defaulted regularly on their debts, openly or through inflation. With the development of efficient tax systems, the state's need to borrow diminished. But not all tax systems are efficient, and taxes remain, in an important sense, voluntary. The 20th century saw two of the most deadliest wars in history, so it's not surprising that state debts shot up to heights considered astronomical, nor that the First World War was followed by the Great Inflation, and that was followed by the Great Depression. Well, morality. Where does morality come in to this question of and debtors? It's very, very forgiveness. Any kind of debt forgiveness destroys people's willingness to lend money. The root of credit is credo, I believe. A lend back in money of equivalent value, and creditors have enslaved, imprisoned, defaulting debtors throughout history or seized their properties. And England exported its debtors to the colonies in the 19th century. And the 19th century, in fact, was the golden age of the bondholder, with real economic growth and falling prices, giving government debt a rising yield, a rising real yield. So 19th century was good for creditors, bad for debtors. However, the debtor position has had moral support as well. All religions have supported debt forgiveness and abhorred debt slavery. It was customary for new rulers to declare a debt amnesty, as in the Jubilee law of the Babylonians, which was recorded in the Christian Bible. Solon, the famous Greek lawgiver, cancelled the debts of Athenian farmers in the 6th century BCE. And the position of debtors was further strengthened by the Abrahamic Christian Islamic prohibition of usury, taking interest on the loan of money. Anti-usury laws ran from the earliest times till the 19th century, and they were only abolished in Britain in 1837, which isn't such a long time ago, and they still exist in Islamic countries. Medieval folk believed usurers were prematurely carried off to hell, or that their money turned to withered leaves. They occupy the 7th circle of hell in Dante's Divine Comedy. I think there were two main moral considerations. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold, so you must forgive me if I sniff from time to time. Two moral considerations lay behind the anti-usury legislation. The first stemmed from the idea that the debt contract is a kind of unfair trade. Since the lender is nearly always in a stronger position than the borrower, it was felt that the borrower needed protection from the lender's greed. Therefore, state and custom tried to keep the interest on lending money as low as possible. But secondly, there was the long-standing moral hostility to making money out of money. This goes all the way to Aristotle's view that money is by nature sterile, so that interest on money rewards no productive activity. Well, then you come to scientific economics, and everything switches around because scientific economics dropped the moral taboos and legal restrictions against taking interest. It treats interest as a justified payment for the cost of postponing consumption. If interest were denied or limited, there would be less incentive to save, a disincentive to lend, and therefore less investment and slower growth. I mean, that's the modern theory. And the market will produce the required equilibrium between saving and investment. So Keynes was being distinctly unmodern and almost medieval when he defended the medieval usury laws. He wrote in 1945, in other words, it is usury to extract from the borrower some amount additional to the true sacrifice of the lender, which the weakness of the borrower's bargaining position or his extreme need make feasible. I find it interesting to put it this way because it really amounts to exactly the same thing as my theory of liquidity preference. And so Keynes's theory of liquidity preference, which is a theory of a propensity to hoard money in times of difficulty, for which a high rate of interest is demanded, is very, very similar to the medieval arguments against taking interest from debtors in their need. And Keynes was, of course, very influenced when he wrote this in 1945. He was applying for a loan from the United States to cover Britain's debts immediate during and after the war. And so the idea he was writing that it is usury to charge high interest to a debtor in need reflects very much the contemporary situation that he faced in 1945. So what did he mean by all this? I want to follow his train of thought, starting with the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, because all his economics really comes out of the Treaty of Versailles and his reactions to the Treaty of Versailles. As you know, this was the treaty that ended the First World War. And of the First World War belligerents, the United States, whose participation was briefest, was the chief creditor. All the others were debtors. The Bolsheviks had repudiated Russia's debts, and so the newly formed Soviet Union wasn't part of the debt collection story, nor were Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, whose successor states were subject to separate treaties, which included indemnities which were never paid. What the United States mainly wanted was for its European allies to pay back what it had lent them during the war. As President Calvin Coolidge said, "We hired them the money, didn't we? We expect it back." So there's a and France, but before America entered, Britain had also borrowed from Britain. So there was this huge debt spaghetti junction. But basically what Britain and France was for Germany to pay reparations, for them to pay back the United States. So naturally, they were interested in raising the level of German reparations as high as possible. But how much could Germany pay? I mean, that was the economic question, and that was at the heart of Keynes's economic consequences of the peace. Now, the Treaty of Versailles called on Germany, and I'm quoting, to make compensation for all the damage done to the civilian population of the Allied and associated powers and their property. And what the Allies wanted really was they read that to mean that Germany should pay the whole cost of the war. Every penny of the war should be paid by Germany, amounting to huge, huge amounts of money, of course, but to annual payments of $120 million for 30 years. Now you've got to multiply that by 20 or 30 to realize what actually was the scale of payments being demanded. Keynes was the British Treasury's chief representative at the Paris Peace Conference, and he was appalled by the attitude of his own representatives. And in April 1999, he produced what he called "My Grand Scheme for the Rehabilitation of Europe," the first typically ingenious of his many plans for reordering the economic affairs of the world. Put simply, what he wanted was the cancellation or heavy reduction of all Allied debts to each other, and the balance of these debts to be discharged by means of the German debt. Everything was scaled down enormously. Germany would issue bonds free of interest for 5 years and jointly guaranteed by the belligerents to settle its reparations bill and in payment of all inter-Allied war debt. So Germany would pay for the debts that had been incurred by Britain, France, and Italy, but they were so scaled down that they were well within Germany's capacity to pay, as Keynes and others read. They came to about 2% of GDP a year. And, well, what do you think the Americans thought of Keynes's plan? Not too much. We hired them the money, and Keynes was proposing that we cancel the debt. They rejected it, and as postponed. But basically, Keynes's plan reduced the German debt to 1/20th of what the Allies had asked for. So it was a huge reduction, and even some of the bonds were to go to Germany to pay for its rehabilitation. So it was a very ingenious plan, and like many of Keynes's plans, it was rejected. And now, so what happened? Reparations diplomacy then took over. And what the main aim of the diplomats was to get, was the British attempt to get Germany to accept an appearance of the debt that was large enough, and the French to accept the reality that it was very small. So that's what diplomats are for, aren't they? To spread fiction around the place so that everyone can accept what the other is saying. And Germany said, no, if you charge us anything, we'll go bust, and there'll be a flood of cheap German exports, which would destroy jobs in the receiving countries. And so the conflicting demands of creditors and debtors were squared by the issue of fictitious German government bonds. There were 3 classes of bonds: A bonds, B bonds, and C bonds. A bonds and B bonds were supposed to be paid back, and C bonds were postponed to never, never, never. Most of the debt was in C bonds. So the debt looked large, but the reality was very much smaller. And Keynes regarded it all as a charade. He said, it's foolish to suppose that any means exist by which one modern nation can extract another a tribute continuing over many years. So what happened was that between 1923 and 1932, the German debt was whittled down by successive debt restructurings, and a means of paying it was secured by loans from American banks. So the debt was reduced, and the American banks started to lend Germany money to pay the debt, the reduced debt. Keynes found all this very, very amusing, but also pretty tragic. He wrote, the United States lends money to Germany, Germany transfers the equivalent to the Allies pay it back to the United States government. Nothing real passes. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany really paid about 1/10 of its reparation bill, presented to it in 1921. And since the Allies all stopped paying their debts to the United States in 1931 as well, and its own loans to Germany had gone bad, America had in effect paid reparations to Germany. So that was the madness of this debt-creditor relationship. In 1929, you got the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. Foreign loans to Germany dried up. The American banks took out all their money, just as they did from Greece in 2008, 2009, 2010, and from other Mediterranean countries. And that meant that Germany had to pay honestly and not rely on loans by dint of raising taxes and cutting public spending. So it managed by doing these things to generate the required primary surplus to meet its obligations, but at the cost of intensifying the slump. The German economy shrank by 25% between 1929 and 1932. Unemployment rose to 35%. The policy of fulfilling the Versailles Treaty paved the way for Hitler, who promptly repudiated Germany's remaining liabilities. So, can you see any echoes of this in more recent events? What one would say is that creating fictions to solve these creditor-debtor problems always ends up badly. You better not get into them in the first place. Now, reflecting on this whole 1931 episode, Keynes wrote as follows in 1931: "The war debts are a case of pure usury. We borrowed nothing except for the purposes of war. War loans should never be made except out of sympathy for the cause of the borrower and the gradual repayment of the sum lent without interest. If I lend to a man to help him expand his business, I'm entitled to ask interest. But if I lend money to a friend to help him of my earning a profit," and I mean, so that was his basic thing. Interest was allowable under some conditions, and he followed the conditions very closely laid down by the Summa Theologica of St. Aquinas, when he made some exceptions against taking usury. Well, now I come to what effect did this have on Keynes's economics, because this is where we get to the heart of things. It led Keynes to reassess the moral and economic basis of what he called classical economic theory, though we would now call it neoclassical economic theory. The economic basis of the creditor position rested on the crucial importance of saving for capital accumulation. I mean, this was the root of the creditor argument. Capital accumulation required saving, and in order to encourage saving, you have to pay interest on saving. Interest is the cost of the consumption foregone by the act of saving. And as Keynes wrote in The Economic Consequences of RePEcT, in Victorian times, 19th century, the duty of saving became 9/10 of virtue, and the growth of the cake the object of true religion. Now, you can already see an ironic tone there. The duty of saving became 9/10 of virtue. He's already not talking about it in the accents of a true believer. He's slightly poking fun at it, but he doesn't yet repudiate the doctrine. And the point is this: in a primitive agricultural economy, saving and investment are the same thing without banks. The farmer spends part of his produce, to improve his tools. Now, the classical economists went on maintaining that saving and investment were the same thing, even after you'd had banks established, and savers and investors were different sorts of people. And what they did was they said there was an equilibrating mechanism that would bring the two, saving decisions and investment decisions, together. And this was the rate of interest. A positive return on lending and guarantee of repayment was required to introduce people to save. And they had to save in order for capital to accumulate. The accumulation of capital was a function of the of saving. That was the class. Keynes's doubts about this whole idea, this whole way of putting things, came gradually only. First, he came to doubt whether saving, the psychological propensity to save, had any close connection with the accumulation of capital at all. Here's an important passage from the Treatise on Money in 1931. I'm quoting Keynes. "It has been usual to think of the accumulated wealth of the world as having been painfully built up out of the voluntary abstinence from the immediate enjoyment of consumption, which we call thrift. But it should be obvious that mere abstinence is not enough by itself to build cities or drain fens. It's enterprise which builds and improves the world's possessions. Not only may thrift, saving, exist without enterprise, but as soon as thrift gets ahead of enterprise, it positively discourages the recovery of enterprise. If enterprise is afoot, wealth accumulates, whatever may be happening to thrift. And if enterprise is asleep, wealth decays, whatever thrift is doing." There's a separation. There are two different motives. There's a motive to save and there's a motive of enterprise. And you mustn't call them by the same thing and believe that they're equilibrated simply by the rate of interest. So he has a note. We're already in the Great Depression years here. He has a note on saving and usury in 1932. "The social evil of usury, as conceived by the medieval church," that is the Roman Catholic Church, "was essentially due to the fact that in the circumstances of the time, saving almost always had its counterpart in debts, not in assets, so that interest was usury, debts not in assets." See the reference back to the First World War, all these debts, but where were the assets being created to service the debts? You see, so the first equation, in other words, is in this whole schema, is that between saving and debt. Saving creates a debt, lending creates a debt, full stop. The equation between saving and investment requires a separate consideration of why it is that people invest, which depends on the expectation of profit. Now, here we come to the heart of the economics of it. Since the rational expectations revolution of the 1970s, which you all know about, economists have come to believe that expectation of profit is mathematically calculable, so that investment takes place whenever the rate of interest exceeds the cost, including the cost of borrowing. But Keynes denied that investors had any such certainty about the future outcome of their investments. This being so, investment was likely to be highly unstable. You're pledging money today for returns which you expect to start coming in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. What will be the state of the world then? How can you calculate a probability of a return which you then compare with the existing and expected rate of interest over that time in order to have a rational investment policy? How can it be done? It can't be done, and Keynes says people don't do it that way anyway. This is one of those polite fictions of economics and bankers and investment brokers. Now, what actually happens? And here I quote from the general theory: "The system's instability is partly due to the characteristic of human nature that a large proportion of our positive activities depend on spontaneous optimism rather than on mathematical calculation. Most probably our decisions to do something positive, the full consequences of which will be drawn over many, many days to come, can only be taken as the result of animal spirits. The spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average quantitative benefit multiplied by quantitative probabilities. In other words, we don't calculate these things, we decide to do them because we feel optimistic. And in reverse, we decide not to do them because something's happened which makes us pessimistic, like a crash or something like that. So you have a completely different way of looking at this investment, saving, net you do from the they say, fine, there's a shock to investment, fine. There's bad news, so investment, the investment falls, yes? But saving remains the same. And therefore, what happens? No problem, they say, no problem. The rate of interest now adjusts because there are more savings and less investment. The rate of interest falls to equilibrate the supply of savings with the demand for investment. So, but Keynes says, you know, and that fall in the rate of interest is the exact counterpart of the fall in the desire to invest. That's what should happen, and that means equilibrium is maintained at an unchanged level of output. It's a price adjustment, you see, it's a price adjustment mechanism, and therefore there's no slump. You just have a fall in the demand for one thing, a rise in the demand for something else. And it's exactly how an equilibrium system works, yes? But Keynes doesn't believe that story at all. He writes as follows: the volume of investment depends on two sets of judgment about the future, neither of which rests on an adequate or secure foundation. On the one hand, on the propensity to hoard, how much you want to save, and on the other hand, on the opinions of the future yield of capital assets. Nor is there any reason to suppose that the fluctuations in one of these factors will tend to offset the fluctuations in the other. When a more pessimistic view is taken about future yields of investment, there's no reason why there should be a diminished propensity to save. Indeed, the same circumstances which yield to pessimistic views about future yields are apt to increase the propensity to hoard. So what does that mean? You have a flight from investment and therefore an increase in saving. What does that do to the rate of interest? It doesn't bring it down. It actually the increased propensity to save, which is the counterpart, will tend to raise the rate of interest because you have more desire to save now. Therefore, you need a higher rate of interest to persuade you not to save. And whereas the classical story said that the rate of interest automatically falls when investment demand falls off. So it's exactly the opposite that happens. Recovery, then, he says, will be impossible by purely monetary operations on the rate of interest. There's no natural tendency for the rate of interest to fall in a slump. And monetary policy might try and get it to fall, but it may not be very successful. And we'll come to quantitative easing in a minute. So only public investment can do the job and bring about a fall in interest rates. And Keynes looked for a continuing high level of public investment permanently to reduce the long-term rate of interest on private loans towards zero. If you keep the public investment going long enough, then of course you can get the rate down, the rate of interest will fall nationally. And naturally, it will also face a lower rate of interest. In other words, it's an anti-hoarding and an anti-usury. Public investment is an anti-usury mechanism in the way Keynes described it. And then he says, what would that mean? He says, this would mean the euthanasia of the rentier, and consequently of the cumulative oppressive power of the capitalist to exploit the scarcity value of capital. Interest today rewards no genuine sacrifice. And more than that, no more than does the rent of land. An intrinsic reason for such scarcity, in the sense of a genuine sacrifice, which could only be called forth by the offer of a reward in the shape of interest, would not exist. So there, from Versailles, he gets really the germs of the theory of how the creditor-debtor relationship can go wrong and cause economies to fail. Now, what happens then afterwards? Well, I want to deal briefly. Have I got a few moments left? I want to deal briefly with how Keynes turned to the question of redressing the creditor-debtor imbalance internationally. So he goes from international to domestic, and now back to international. Why back to international? Because there's another war, another Second World War. So the whole international issue arises again. It's in this context that the role of America, the chief creditor at Versailles in 1919, takes center stage. Throughout the 1920s, the United States ran a current account surplus. In modern accounting terms, it had surplus domestic savings to lend to deficit states. Private American loans, mainly short-term, and flowing to Europe, Latin America, Japan, and China, kept the world economy afloat in the 1920s. However, in 1929, as we've seen, the surplus country went on strike. It withdrew its loans. There were no more loans available to finance interest payments or refinance debts. The debtors had to start paying America back from their own resources. And of course, they defaulted, but not before the cancellation of American lending caused the collapse of the European, Latin American, and Asian economies, leading to the breakdown of the gold standard in 1931. And that was followed by a decade of currency and trade wars, the 1930s, and in turn by the war of German revenge for Versailles, which Keynes had predicted in 1919. So he's quite good at prediction, even though the future is uncertain. He's sort of the logic of the case is not the data, it's the logic of the argument that Keynes was, brilliant at. And it is in reaction to the tragic consequences of the accumulation of unpayable international debts that Keynes in 1941 said, okay, we've got this new situation. What are we going to do about it? Here's my plan: International Clearing Union. Key point in adjustment of current account imbalances under the gold standard was compulsory for the debtor. They had to adjust, and voluntary for the creditor. The creditor didn't have to adjust at all. He just went on piling up surpluses if he wanted. He could then lend them out. But suppose he didn't lend them out, then you would have an incredible deflationary pressure that surplus countries, think Germany today, exert on debtor countries. What does Keynes try to do to settle this? A mechanism must be put in place to force the creditor to adjust, and not just the debtor. As he put it, a simultaneous pressure on both surplus and deficit countries to balance their accounts without recourse to borrowing. That's the point. This was the object of his clearing union. Specifically, no member country of the union would be allowed to continue to run a current account surplus. Positive end-of-year balances in the accounts of members would be taxed. And if they persisted for 2 years, those positive balances would be confiscated and redistributed to the debtor accounts. No debt relief, no debt bondage would be involved. Now, of course, who was not in favor of this scheme? the Americans, who are bound to be the chief creditors, whose surpluses were scheduled for confiscation under Keynes's plan if they didn't lend out. They wanted to keep control over their lending, so they vetoed Keynes's clearing union. And instead, a system was set up known as the Bretton Woods system, with the IMF as a modified version of the gold standard. And under the IMF rules, surplus countries can go on running surpluses and demanding their pound of flesh in return for their loans, and the IMF offers only temporary help from the International Monetary Fund to put their houses in order on conditions, as Turkey knows right at the moment. You know, yes, we'll give you short-term loans, but we expect you to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, yeah? And in the case of Greece, install a debtors cartel in your capital to make sure you do. I don't know whether Turkey's been subjected to this. Well, then, so Keynes's plan is rejected. There's the IMF, and then we move fast forward. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I've only got a couple of pages left, to Milton Friedman's monetarist counter-revolution in the 1970s and the Thatcher-Reagan supply-side reforms of the 1980s to restore the creditor to restore to the creditor class a great deal of the control over the value of money, which it had had before and which it had lost in the Keynesian system. And in other words, you set up a system which imposed policy and legal impediments to inflation. And we know what that was. I mean, independent central banks with inflation targeting and operational control over interest rate policy, given a mandate to keep inflation about 2% a year. And surplus countries, and this also enabled a Eurozone, a single currency area, to be set up in 1999 as a gold standard in its most rigid form. I mean, the Eurozone is a gold standard, and it doesn't even have an IMF. Surplus countries were put under no constraint in accumulating surpluses. Deficit countries were denied 4 crucial protections, which the Bretton Woods system did offer: trade controls, capital controls, short-term official lending facilities, and the possibility of small devaluations, none of which are possible in the Eurozone. And so what was the assumption behind this? It was a strictly neoclassical assumption that competitive pressures would force all members into a competitive equilibrium without any need of these other interferences. And so the sequence of events leading up to the crash of 2008, 2019, in an eerie way, it sort of repeats that sequence leading to the crash only not the what happened by borrowing from non-banks, construction for residential purposes. You could say they were directed towards accumulation of capital assets, but these were very flaky capital assets because they depended entirely on people coming to use these residential facilities. They could rely on the climate, but what if there was a pandemic? I mean, you know, the whole thing then became waste, and then you just had the debts. You didn't have the assets. The assets were not operating to generate revenue. And that's really what happened after 2009, 2010. And then it started to happen again in 2020, 2021. And so Greece, we know about Greece The interesting argument, repetition in Greece, is that between 2010 and 2015, Greek government under George Papandreou, laid down by the Troika of creditors for the loan. And Greece said, and Papandreou said, we will abide by this. And because they wanted a debt restructuring and cancellation, and they thought they could do it that way by accepting the terms that the Troika imposed on them. But in 2015 came a debtors' revolt. In January 2015, the Greeks elected a left-wing government headed by the Syriza party to fight the cuts that the Troika was imposing. On 28th of June 2015, this episode is quite important. The Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, called for a referendum on whether to accept the creditors' conditions for a fresh loan. 68% of the Greeks voted to reject the creditors' demands, and the Prime Minister accepted the demands. He felt Greece was too weak to go against the demands of the Troika, and that led to the resignation of Yanis Varoufakis, the flamboyant Greek finance minister. Well, you know, what conclusion do you draw? The creditors say, look, we were right. We forced Greece not to pay back the whole thing, but to pledge to pay back something. And what's more, we forced an austerity policy on it, which has been very good. Greece was able to generate a primary surplus in 2015. But what a cost! 300,000 civil servants laid off. Unemployment rose to 25%, with 40% young people out of work. Rising rates of homelessness, emigration, suicide. And this spectre is still there. Greece hasn't recovered. It recovered properly. Spain hasn't recovered properly before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. It's one of the weakest recoveries on record from a slump in the Eurozone. And Keynes wrote in 1923, the abhorrent and why theoretically wrong, cutting recovery, when recovery comes, it's feeble. So that's really my tale. And of course, I'm willing to answer any questions you may have about, you know, anything I've said or how it relates to anything going on at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your great presentation, Professor SKIDELSKY. And we all wish a monetary system which is fair between states and between creditors and debtors. Professor SKIDELSKY reminded us the great vision of Lord Keynes by making great references to the greatest economic crisis in the history. And as he said, Keynes was right before the economic crisis, and in parentheses, he was the person to bring solution to it at the end. Professor also put Keynesian light on the current economic crisis. And let me be the intermediary for the questions if there are. I will be checking both Zoom.
I can't hear you. I think
no? No?
Your internet connection is unstable, I'm told. I didn't, I missed some of what you said. Maybe you can't hear me either.
I can hear you. Now, can you hear me? No?
Yes, yes, I can start hearing you again.
Okay.
But you freeze time to time.
I'm sorry for my connection. Okay, it's time for questions. Okay.
We have a question. I write our Zoom chat line, dear Professor Bulbul. You can try it.
Okay. I'll be intermediary for you, Professor. Mr. Özgür asks, what do you think of Keynes? The third way or the debate on liberal socialism? Can you hear me? Professor? Özgür, sen yardımcı olur musun bana? Soruyu sen sorar mısın? Benim connection'da problem var galiba.
Dear Professor, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. I will direct you a question from our YouTube channel. The question is, what do you think of Keynes, the third way or the debate on liberal socialism?
Well, I mean, Keynes was trying to find a middle way between laissez-faire and the state, yes? I mean, the state, totalitarian systems of his day, fascist system particularly, and also communism. So he said, you don't need, in order to get a good economics, you don't need such bad politics. You can have a democratic system can deal with the problem of massive underemployment and also inequality. They can be dealt with by within a democracy, provided you have the right tools and the right ideas. So that was his answer. I mean, he gave liberal societies weapons with which to fight the totalitarians and the fascists. And we have to find similar weapons today, because otherwise we are going to drift into a kind of proto-fascism sooner or later. Authoritarianism that actually satisfies the needs of people and is seen as fair by them, then of course you'll get authoritarians. I mean, there is what's called an illiberal liberalism or democracy in Hungary. And Hungary has quite good economics, actually, but the politics are not liberal. And so that's what Keynes tried to guard against. I think that's a good answer. That's the answer I'd give to your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, and thank you very much for your valuable contribution to our symposium. We are very grateful that you have been so generous with your time and commitment by agreeing to be part of the symposium. So thank you very much for your participation and support again to us.
Thanks. So that ends the session now. Are we ending? No more questions, is that right? Would anyone have any?
Professor, you left no room for questions because your presentation was perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay.
If you can hear me, I'll be saying something. Okay. Thank you for helping us not to forget Keynesian economics, which was, is, and will be, and in my belief, should be on the agenda of economists. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.